So we're going to be covering what is connectedness, what difference it makes. We're going to go through some science, but make it really interactive and interesting, as you would expect from us. So do expect to participate at various stages during the webinar. You'll notice, unfortunately, that your videos aren't active, but your audio will be. And obviously, we can be busy in the chat as well. So please feel free to engage in the conversation. So we've got two of us who are hosting today, so myself and Ben. I'll introduce myself and then hand over. So hi, I'm Laura Walker, and I work as a whole variety of different things, mostly around learning and development, talent management, and organisation effectiveness. I've worked in 6 different industries, usually in a combination of those roles. Now I work as a researcher, so I'm undertaking a PhD researching in this space. But also as a coach and as a consultant. So I have a real blend of work. But what that means is I'm really passionate about evidence, about science, but also making it useful and practical, which is why I'm really excited to share some great insight with you today. Welcome, Ben.
Laura, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ben, Ben George. As you can see on the screen, I'm an HF associate consultant. And what's really brought me to this webinar with you today is the fact that I spend most of my day working with clients in different organizations around the world, helping them solve problems and building solutions for them. So that typically means doing some research based on their needs and providing program design and delivery. So in whatever field that looks like. And this particular area seemed to spring to certainly my attention during the sort of pandemic time, and as we've sort of moved through that into sort of the way we work now, the idea of connectedness seems to be part and parcel of many more conversations, particularly as it relates to things like performance and change that we're going to be doing today. So it's great to be with you, and thanks for taking some time. I know everybody's busy these days, which is going to be pertinent to the topic that we're going to be talking about. So without further ado, let me share with you our plan for the next sort of 50 minutes or so. We will have a time for a Q&A as we get to the end as well, but essentially we're going to just start by just making sure we're all on the same page and share a definition of what is connectedness, because it can mean different things to different people. And then when you don't have it, what's the consequence, and how does it affect us? So we've got some really interesting, I'm hoping you find it really interesting, ideas around that, and also we'll share with you some of the research that we've been using to support our approach with our clients. So we've got a couple of polls to share with you as well. We just want to get a sense of where you are with some of these ideas before we look at our sort of 5 areas or 5 points of interest or insights that we're looking to share with you. We'll be giving you lots of information at that stage, and then we'll have time to pause based on that insight and perhaps do a little bit of reflection. We've got a great tool that we've developed that we'll share with you that can help you do that. And then I'm hoping we'll have time for a bit of broader reflection and sharing about, in our own organizations and what we do, what are the types of things that we've been up to that helps build connectedness within our organizations and within our teams. And then at the end, we've got a bit of time for Q&A, and hopefully we can share some resources with you as well. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. We want to make it really useful and practical and engaging for you. So thanks again for taking the time to be with us. So let me start with this question. And can I ask you to sort of pop the answer into the chat if you'd like? When you think about connectedness, what sort of things spring to mind? How would you try and sort of almost define it? And feel free to Google it. But what does it mean to you when you think about connectedness, which is really the sort of central topic for today, and how that influences and supports change, certainly in the workplace? What does connectedness mean to you? Nice one, Tim. Yeah, absolutely. Having an affinity with another person. Vicky saying engagement. This idea of tuning into others, matching values. Zoe saying they're staying connected to colleagues and being engaged. Absolutely. So when you get it, you kind of feel it. Nice one, Judy. Trust is definitely part of it as well. It certainly helps us get things done in teams and in the workplace when there is trust. Let me share with you a definition, and I'm going to start sort of layering in some of the, I just think there's been some really cool work, and Laura and I are bursting to share some of the insights that we've been sort of inspired by. that have brought us to you today. So here's a definition. So connected, and there's quite a few of them out there, but this is the sort of simple one that I think most of us can get our hands around. It refers to the emotional and psychological bond between people. So to some extent, tuning into others, Vicky, understanding Hania, having an affinity, absolutely, which is driven by this sort of innate need for social interaction and purpose. That's where we're starting with. So as a starting point, just to make sure we're all on the same page, that's the way we're sort of going to be approaching it. What happens when you don't have it? And this is often, I think, the driver. So we're also going to be exploring the impact of workplace loneliness. I'm sure many of you come across this idea of, you know, this epidemic of loneliness that was going on way before COVID. COVID gave it a spotlight and exacerbated things. It still seems to be an issue for many of the teams, particularly as we're wrestling with different ways of working, hybrid working, etc. So it's important, I guess, to understand the consequences of not having connectedness. And there's a definition here from two chaps that wrote this book called Connectable. It's a brilliant reference, by the way, in terms of a resource, practical resource full of great tips that I'd strongly recommend you go find out. So their definition is that workplace loneliness is the distress, so the stress and distress caused by a perceived inadequacy of quality connections to others. And I think the pertinent thing there for many of us is that it's perceived. So what might be a perception of loneliness for me or a lack of connectedness is very different to somebody else. You know, if you think about what that means from an introverted perspective and an extroverted perspective, it doesn't necessarily mean being surrounded by people is going to make you more connected. In fact, you can feel a lack of connection and lonely amongst groups of people. Think about going into a conference room where there's all of that noise and chatter. You're the only one in there that doesn't know anybody. You feel pretty lonely in that instant. So that's what we're looking to try and mitigate. We'll talk about some of the challenges. I think UK economy, they estimate it's £2.5 billion a year is impacted by this impact of loneliness. Most of that is through attrition in the workplace, about 1.6 billion. And for those of us that have suffered significantly with this notion of loneliness, they've equated it and monetized it. And we can share the government report on this, about £9,500 a year. So there's a significant kind of, you know, impacts on organizations and the broader economy. So what does this mean in the context of leadership and the role of leaders?
So some of you may be familiar with our management and leadership framework. We launched it a few months ago now, and one of the things that we have here, as you can see, are 10 top capabilities that all leaders and managers need to develop. There's more on our website, so if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to discover more. And what we're saying here is that today's conversation is basically a double click onto one of those capabilities. So we're digging into it and understanding what it means for leaders and what it means for us as people working in organizations. So we're getting really into the nitty gritty of what it means. And it's positioned here as primarily a tool set, but also a mindset and a skill set that goes with connectedness. And we'll unpack that as we go through the next few minutes. Okay. But in true Hemsley style, we're going to get you involved now. So just to start the juices flowing around this subject, we've got 3 questions for you. So we're going to pop up some polls in a minute, but let me just orient you to the first question. So the first question, you need to pay attention because we're asking you for which statement is false. So which statement is false? Does uncertainty tolerance, I'll talk a bit more about what that is a bit later, but does uncertainty tolerance, our tolerance of uncertainty, does it tend to increase with age? Is it higher for women than men? Associated with higher levels of education and strongly related to creativity? So which one, if we pop up the poll, is false, if you remember? And you just pick one. So let's see how that's coming. So dive onto the poll and then we'll see how we're doing.
We're halfway through responses, just waiting for a few more.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what do you think? Which one do you think is false?
We're at 71% of answers.
Right. Let's take a look then. All right, so what we've got is we've got 31% think it may not increase with age. 13% think it may be higher for men than women. So the biggest vote for the false is that it's strongly related to creativity. So we think that statement might be false. So that's at 38%. So it's probably between creativity and age. Now, the evidence that we have from this study here actually shows it's not higher for women than men. So obviously that does mean that it does typically increase with age as we have more experiences under our belt. It is linked to higher education, so a higher educational level, and it is connected with creativity. So if you feel that you can cope with tolerance, you're more open to new ideas. So it's connected with openness. Okay, let's have a look at question number 2. So slightly different aspect of connectivity. So this one is, which of these do you believe is correct? So we're back to correct. Research shows the size of someone's professional and personal network has shrunk since the pandemic. But by how much? Do you think our networks have shrunk by 5%, 15%, or 30%? Okay, so here's poll number 2. How much have our networks shrunk by since the pandemic? 5, 15, or 30%, according to this particular study. Okay, what do you think?
Waiting on a handful more.
Just have a guess. There's no right or wrong here. We're not recording who says what or who gets the best scores or anything. It's a safe environment to have a go. Okay, do we have the, oh, there we go. Excellent. So we have a split. So 30% of people believe that, 56%. So most people believe that our networks have shrunk by 30%. And 44% by 15%. This particular study did find 15%, so that middle answer. And what they also found was that what has happened is that people's networks are now focused more around their immediate teams and their immediate close contacts. So it's the cross-organizational networks primarily that have shrunk, or the external networks. So people have kind of hunkered down basically into their closer networks. Okay, and our final question for this particular round relates to this idea of social capital. So social capital is a measure of how socially connected we are. So the nature of those connections, the number, the quality, etc. So which of these factors are associated with higher social capital? Is happiness associated with higher, better job prospects, cardiovascular health, positive health-seeking behaviour, or all of the above? So which of these are associated with higher social capital? And you just need one choice. Okay, let's see. And again, there's no monitoring of what people are doing, so just play along, have a go. Just start you thinking about it. Okay.
Have a look.
Yes, please. Thanks, Katie. This is a very clear message, I think, on this one. So we have 78% of people who believe it is all of the above, and you are all correct. So higher social capital is associated with all of those benefits. which maybe, given the topic that we're talking about today, probably isn't a big surprise. So it brings lots of benefits to be connected across our networks. Okay, so thank you for participating in that. It was just to get your juices flowing, partly because we're going to move now into some key insights for you. So we mentioned earlier that we've got 5 key areas of insight. So we're going to share these with you relatively pacily. If you've got any clarifying questions, please drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we will have plenty of time for a conversation later or for any questions that it poses. Okay, so the first key insight, I'm going to take you through the first couple. The first one is that the experience, if you call it that, of uncertainty has a major impact on us physiologically and psychologically, and there's a bunch of evidence to show this. So first of all, the experience of prolonged uncertainty has a major wear and tear, because essentially uncertainty creates the same level of physical arousal as a fear reaction. So it's basically fear over time, and our bodies are not made for that prolonged fear reaction. And what basically happens, for example, is if you have chronic job insecurity, so long-term uncertainty about something really important to you, it is a stronger predictor of poor health than smoking or high blood pressure. It has a major impact even on things like life expectancy. So it is a really important thing to pay attention to, is the impact of uncertainty. The second aspect around the impact of uncertainty, sorry, I'm still, if you go back up to, thank you, Ben, is really around the impact that it has on our thinking. So it has an impact on our physiology, but it also distorts how we think. So what happens when you're uncertain about the environment that you're in is you are drawn to people that you know like you. So this is a natural psychological response. So what happens is you're more likely to get things like groupthink, you're more likely to get less creative solutions for issues that you're facing, either individually or as an organization. You get pulled towards the people that you are sure about because of that uncertainty. And also what uncertainty does is it limits our ability to act. And the way I like to think of this is, if you have a storm approaching, the expectation of the storm and that worrying time can be absolute agony, and pain, as we know, is associated with this. But once the storm hits and you know that your fence has fallen down or your house is destroyed, hopefully not, then you can act. And it's almost a relief. Well, it is a relief, because then you can get into the what can I do about it, and you can move on. And afterwards, then the relief of the lack of uncertainty, you know what you're dealing with, then you can get on with it. And as humans, we're natural problem solvers, so it kicks into what we're doing. So uncertainty has a major impact on us. Thanks, Ben. Let's talk about what that means in terms of being ready for change and uncertainty. In the quiz, we talked a little bit about ambiguity tolerance, and if you're not sure what it is, here's a definition on this slide for you to read. But what it is, it's actually a trait. So it's a psychological trait that can be measured and grown. So you can grow your ability to tolerate uncertainty and ambiguity. And it's particularly important around leaders. And there's a bit of a mixed story on studies on this. So some studies suggest that leaders actually often have a lower ambiguity tolerance than their teams, because they've developed this desire to know the answer to things, and it be more challenging than for them to not know. But again, like I say, that's a bit of a mixed story. In our model, we believe that change readiness and being able to navigate uncertainty is a core capability that includes mindset, skill set, and tool set. So often change processes in the past or change methodologies are focused on tool set. But actually now, with the advent of an increasingly uncertain world, you also need a change-ready mindset, which is open and curious, as well as a skill set to work with people during ambiguity, and then the ability to apply the relevant tools. So it's a more rounded capability. And then the final aspect on this around change readiness is we often think about needing to be agile during times of uncertainty and change. But actually, the evidence suggests that we need to be both agile and stable. So the best leaders for helping people through ambiguity provide both of these things. So they're responsive to things that are happening, they're paying attention to trends, external events, but they're also providing stability around things like high standards, clear goals, consistent rhythms and habits, team habits and man patterns, and people know what to expect so that they can then cope with the ambiguity on other things. They're not having to worry about the ambiguity around how often they're going to talk to their manager, for example. So you need to get that right balance. And there's a really nice study from McKinsey that show that organizations who get the right balance between stability and agility are 70% more likely. So they have a 70% chance, rather, of being in the upper quartile for organizational health. So it feeds through. So if you can provide that stability and agility, it feeds through to organizational health, basically. Okay, that's the first two. Over to you, Ben.
Let me jump back to connectedness, and then we'll try and make the link between connectedness and uncertainty. Thanks, Laura. So it turns out that we're wired for connections and being connected to others. And if you think back to, previously in our existence on planet Earth, last 200,000 years or so, we've survived and been effective and successful due to the fact that we've been able to connect and work together in teams, probably better than a lot of other mammals that exist in the world, actually. So we're adept at that. And perhaps just because, we're in a bit more of a sophisticated kind of world, we have these snazzy bits of technology, etc. We've still got that kind of hard wiring. So we're wired for these connections. And it means that things like our neurobiology, our mirror neurons are adept at being able to understand people that we are connected to. There is a fabulous piece of work done by a guy called Matt Lieberman and Naomi Etchiner, who have done really interesting work around what's going on in the brain where people feel connected and then they feel disconnected or rejected. In other words, alone. And it turns out that, and I think this is probably one of the pieces of insight that sort of really drew me in, was that when people feel rejected or isolated, it lights up the same pain region of the brain that physical pain is associated with. So let's just think about what that means. If we want our teams to be at their best, we need them to feel connected. And if they don't, and if they feel isolated or alone or rejected from the group or excluded, it means they're not able to do their best. Just imagine trying to do your best work when you have a headache, a grazed knee, even a paper cut can be pretty annoying, right? It's distracting at a minimum, debilitating at best. So it's worth thinking about that. Interestingly, on the study as well, they did it. I thought this is fascinating. So it turns out that if you give people Tylenol, which we don't use anymore, but if you do, it actually cures the same part of the brain that physical pain is cured by. So essentially, painkillers cure social pain. So, and they coined this term, social pain, and we've used it though for a number of years. We say things like, "I'm heartbroken," or and every language around the world has a term for this sort of pain associated with social pain, right? It's absolutely fascinating area, and when we get it right, we get an oxytocin hit pretty much that makes us, it's called the love hormone for those of you that are interested, that makes us feel connected to others and gives us that hit, that sort of positive connected hit, along with dopamine that makes us feel good, and serotonin, again, that's another component that gives us that sort of that hit of being positive. So if we want people to be at their best, we want to provide them with this kind of feeling of connectedness, and as a result, they're more engaged, they're satisfied in the work they do, they're more productive, they're loyal to the cause. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons for it. And I'm sure in the Q&A, there'll be some questions. I'm sure you've all experienced the lack of it and having it and what that feels like as well. But there's a slight nuance. We don't always, this sort of shows up in different ways to different groups of people. And I know Laura wanted to share a bit of insight from some of the work she was doing around understanding Shelley Taylor's work, I think it was, wasn't it? The social psychologist.
Absolutely. So until 1995, the studies around a stress response, we all know the results of that. So we know that the main response to stress is fight or flight. Some people say fight, flight, freeze as a response. But what Shelley did was she dug into this because she noticed that most of the studies, in fact, only 17% of the participants in those studies before 1995 were women. So she was interested in, well, is there a difference? And how do we explain a social response to stress that she was noticing in her work? So she did a bunch of studies, and what she noticed was that we all have the same initial reaction. So as we become stressed, we have that leap in cortisol and adrenaline. So we all have that. So we all have the ability to fight or flight. But what happens with women, because of all of the hormones that are in every single cell of our body, we then get a thrust of oxytocin, which means that we have a slightly different response. And obviously men can have this too in a different context. But what we tend to do, and I certainly do this, is a tend and befriend response. So we look to our loved ones and do the head count. How is everyone? Bring them in, bring them close, make sure everybody's okay. And befriend would be the glass of wine conversation about what's going on for you, and let me just rant and I feel much better as a result. So you share what's going on for you. And if you think about this in terms of caveman times, or whatever, in Neolithic times, I suppose I should probably call it, rather than caveman, that would be a more sensible response to stress. You know, bring people in, look after them, work together, is a very natural response. But it's interesting that the studies initially missed that because they were skewed towards our male participants. Thanks, Ben.
So what does this mean when it comes to the point at hand, or the topic at hand, which is how does connectedness help with this whole, you know, hubbub of uncertainty that many of us are facing with, this sort of relentless tirade? And the cliche is, you know, the only certain thing is uncertainty or change. So we think there are four key bits, and four key things that can be useful to understand this. The first is, when we're connected to others, it's more likely that we'll get insights by working with and collaborating with other people. We get their perspective, we're more likely to understand and being able to navigate through change. If there is a good level of connection, let's call it safe, it links to this idea of psychological safety. We're more likely to try stuff out. We're more likely to move to the edge of our comfort zone, or even go beyond our comfort zones to figure out new ways of working. You know, when we're learning new things, it can be a bit overwhelming at times. When we feel supported, it's okay to make mistakes. It's also worth noting that it's inherently human. From a leadership perspective, just knowing that, you know, when people are connected, it's something natural. Very often, I think leaders can get distracted with this whole idea of task orientation and focus, and actually we may need to relearn how we build connections, right? Particularly with the amount of stuff going on and distraction around us. And then the final bit, I guess, is that it helps us become resilient. So, you know, it's accepting the fact that we all get a bit of we can all get a bit of a hit sometimes with all of the headwinds that present themselves. By building our connectedness to others, we know it's one of the key ways that people are able to bounce back and support growth as change happens. So they're able to grow through the change and uncertainty. So we think these are pretty compelling, and we've been doing so much work over the last few, I guess, years in this, and we've sort of landed on quite tactical things that leaders can, you know, put their arms around and go do. So we've created the SPARK framework, or the SPARK model. There are 5 areas that we think are going to have the biggest impact to help build connections for leaders and their teams. Frankly, anybody, but we're going to focus on leaders for now because we know those folks have a big impact. So the SPARK method is based around a whole bunch of insight that can help build connections. It's like it's a shortcut or guide rails that can help us do that. And the first is being able to share. Now, for those of you that have been doing any work in the psychologically safe space and have read some of Amy Edmondson's work, you'll know that one of the key aspects here is to be vulnerable with folks, right? That doesn't need to be massively vulnerable, but people respond to a vulnerability that other people have. So being open to sharing that, sharing appropriately what's on your mind is one of the key things that can help build connections with others. Next, purposeful. So there's different levels of this. And Laura and I have been having this sort of ongoing discussion between us around there's different types of purpose. Now, in our framework, to keep it quite simple, and frankly, to hit as many folks as possible to make it useful, we're going to look at purposefulness as almost this intent, this purposefulness in a conversation to connect specifically. So things like not interrupting somebody that I have a tendency to do, or to jump in with excitement and enthusiasm, more about listening and being not distracted in the conversation so we can build that connection. Asking is what it says on the tin, right? So this idea of almost coaching and supporting people through open-ended questions, not making assumptions, not making judgment. Recognizing is essentially responding to what's happening, but it could also, so when somebody's demonstrating an emotion, we can demonstrate some sort of empathy. It's also recognizing great work that people do and the effort and the value that they've added, and also giving feedback as well in a constructive way. It's also about recognizing opportunities to grow. And the final bit, and I think this is the important one for many of us, is the consistency bit. So how do you maintain and keep the relationship on track? We know that's a key bit as well. It's so easy to forget. We only pick up the phone when we need something, fall into that sort of trap. How do we manage and keep our relationships going? So that would be our sort of fifth insight that we hope will be useful for you in terms of your consideration. And to help you with that, there is a little exercise we thought you'd be quite useful to know, just to sort of begin to sort of absorb yourself into that content and that model. What we'll do shortly, we'll pop a diagnostic self-assessment into the chat for you to download. For those of you that can, if you're on a mobile device, you might not be able to do this. So in the chat, we'll just put our PDF. Now, for those of you that are savvy with QR codes, I know our marketing team certainly are, you can use your phone, hold it up with your camera switched on, and you should be able to get a link to the site that has the self-assessment. So unfortunately not able to edit it because online, but you should be able to get access to it. If you can do that, that'd be fabulous. And what I thought would be useful, it's quite a quick, simple tool to use. There are 5 components that make up Spark, of course. And there are 3 questions or 3 statements we want you to rate against, 5 being a high score, 1 being a low score. And we just want you to spend a couple of minutes running through those questions. There's a little scorecard at the bottom, by the way. We know it's out of 75. How well do you get on with it? You can download it in the chat if you're able to do that. For those of you that aren't, let me just take you through a couple of the points there so you can play along as well. So the first part of the Spark model, as you can see, it's sharing. So a couple of questions to consider here around, do I feel comfortable sharing personal experiences? That could be emotions, chat and challenges with others. Some people find that super easy to do. Some people really struggle with it. Do I create opportunities for others to share their personal experiences, emotions and challenges? Am I willing to demonstrate vulnerability when I've messed things up? Purposeful is this idea of being intentional and building the connection. So listening to understand, not being distracted by the phone, and not interrupting others. Asking questions is asking, am I genuinely curious and willing to learn about others? Do I encourage open-ended questions to facilitate deeper understanding? And do I avoid overly personal questions? I've fallen into that trap a few times. So there's a bit of a skill to this, of course. But nevertheless, I'm hoping you find it useful as a way of thinking about how you indeed build connections with others. Recognizing is able to respond empathetically. So it's not agreeing, of course, it's being able to play back what you've heard and demonstrate that. I'm able to offer constructive feedback, and also are we aware that we're not diminishing or dismissing people's perspectives or feelings? The final bit is about how do we maintain the relationship? Do I maintain regular communication with others, checking in and building connections? Am I able to celebrate successes and milestones? And do I make an effort to engage in conversations that are personal interest and experience, in addition to work-related topics? So those are the kind of like points on the Spark model or the Spark method, and you can see there's a score sheet in there.
How's anybody getting on? What are your thoughts about how you're doing? I did, I had a go. I had a bit of a sneaky peek earlier on. So obviously I've seen it before, but I did actually have a go through the assessment this morning, and went through it. So I've definitely got some improvement areas.
Nice one, Daniel.
Always a good thing.
Me too.
Yeah. And I put in the chat that it did take me a while to kind of get comfortable. I think maybe because I worked in a 95% male environment for the first 6 years of my career, it did take me a little while to get used to the idea of, you know, work friendships and being vulnerable and being open in that context, because it wasn't necessarily the easiest environment to do that as a 21, 22-year-old blonde in a defense industry. It was a bit challenging, but it has got easier with practice, I guess.
Nice one, Laura. So Rachel's popped in there. Yeah, good. Some clear areas to improve on. Me too, Rachel. I think one of the challenges for me as well, Laura, is this whole idea of sharing, right? And being vulnerable with others. And to what extent do you do that? And I think sometimes it's sort of searching out the right language, isn't it, to do that? Really good stuff. Thank you very much. There is I'm going to drop a link into the chat here before we move to the next bit. Keep your comments coming through. There's a guy called Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is the former US Surgeon General. Love that title, by the way. Not for me, but it's a great title, isn't it? And he's been on the bandwagon and promoting and voicing concern around the epidemic of loneliness. So he's not the only one, but he's done some really interesting work. So I'll drop a link to his. In fact, let me just he's done a couple of things. One of them is an HBR link to a video, but there's also a report that he's put out. It's called an advisory. I'll see if I can get that as a link into the chat in a sec. Oh, it's not quite getting there. I'll try and figure that out in a minute. And one of the things he did was with his team in terms of sharing was this idea of it sounds really simple, but how to really begin, and I'll explain sort of the story. So he was really keen to sort of build these connections within his team, of course, and he understood the impact of isolation and loneliness, particularly in the workplace, but more broadly. And what he did was sort of for 5 minutes in the beginning of his weekly meetings, I think whatever day was Monday, he'd ask everybody in the team, to take turns presenting for 5 minutes on things outside of the workplace that they were super passionate about, right? So, and he just thought, let's just see what happens. And the impact was quite profound across the team. So it wasn't just a person that people found they were connecting more with their stories, and what are the challenges that they're might have been somebody, for example, renovating their house, and just talking about some of the challenges and dramas around that sort of thing. I know, Laura, you're in the process of you're in that process, aren't you? So, but it's but it was more how everybody else was sort of chiming in to learn a little bit more about and provide advice, of course, which is what many of us are programmed to do. And it had this really big. It turned out to be not the cringiest thing that people were sort of like, oh God, not that thing again. It was actually the thing that everybody wanted to do and was excited to learn about. And I just thought it was a lovely way of sort of practically implementing this idea of sharing. So, we've kind of been inspired by these stories and the research over the last few years.
Oh. I've also just popped in, for those who are interested, a short article I did a week or so ago on how can you boost your own ambiguity tolerance. So there's 6 tips in there. So if you're interested in becoming more comfortable in an uncertain world, specifically relation to that, then feel free to check that out. Okay.
Any other thoughts or reflections on the assessment?
I think people might be doing it later. There was one one organizer, actually a colleague of ours, who asked his team members, so they did it as a kind of feedback mechanism as well. So he asked his team to give him feedback on how he was doing around creating connectivity in the team, and they found it really useful. So it's a slightly different lens on it.
Thanks, Laura. So let's shift the lens a little bit more on this as well, and think about, you know, it's an opportunity. You know, it is a connectedness and uncertainty session. So I'm really curious, and it'd be great if possible if you could share, you know, what are the things that you can do, or you do, or have seen done in your organization that can help build connectedness, particularly, you know, over the last sort of few years, where this sort of notion of separation and the lack of connectedness is becoming, I guess, almost more of a threat, and it was perhaps not on the radar, certainly in the workplace domain for a while. What sort of things have you done, or have you seen done, that you could share with the rest of the group as well, so we can sort of pick up an action list of ideas to sort of take away with, or as we sort of move to the back end of the session today? Thanks, Zoe. So this idea of working
so foundational. Sorry.
Yeah.
A really solid foundation for connectedness is psychological safety. So you're well caught. Yeah, nice one, Hania. So it's not always one way. So there might well be, you know, different ideas. So to, you know, crowdsource ideas for connectedness, but also to make sure that, yeah, it suits different members of the team. So there won't be one way, as we touched on at the beginning. Nice one. Yeah,
I think, yeah, this idea of forced fun can be, it's like quite a detriment if it's sort of forced upon you. Yeah, I think that was the challenge with the example I had. I think there was an initial skepticism around it. Nice one, Hania. What else? What other things have you done? Or could do you think, that can help build more connectedness? Let me share an example of a client that we've been working with. So there's a global insurance organization that we're sort of proud partners with and have been working with for a number of years. And we were fortunate to sort of begin our relationship as we were sort of transitioning through to this sort of normal way of working. And they'd made the decision to allow the workforce and the managers to have autonomy around their approach to hybrid working. So, and it was all based around understanding autonomy and choice and control. And one of the concerns that they flagged, and one of the areas that they wanted everybody to focus on in the organization, was this idea of connections and connectedness, with a fear of losing the culture. So rather than sort of marching everybody back into the office, which often a lot of organizations do with the hope that connections can happen, they made the decision to build connection plans within each of the teams. So essentially they've established a template. I think there was a six question template that was, how do we connect? Why do we connect? Where do we connect, and for what purpose? When do we need to come together? How do we connect with other parts of the organization? And how do we sort of role model this as a unit or a group of people? And it was one of those, essentially it's a charter. It's a team charter or agreement, a rule book for the team to operate by, that evolves over time, of course, based on the needs that each team was creating, from the board level all the way through to, you know, everybody else in the organization were facilitating this conversation and created their own sort of connection plans. Let me go to Mark as well in there, in the chat. Giving it time. Connection does take time. Similarity and familiarity. Nice one, Mark. Some interesting ideas around belonging as well, that's sort of clearly linked to connectedness and this topic as well, and this sort of this idea of in-group, or, you know, often referred to as kind of the tribe, based on all of that that sort of that human wiring.
There's some interesting work about cross-generational working as well, so about focusing on the similarities that we have across generations rather than the differences. So rather than pitching groups against each other, so like younger people versus older workers, you can actually help build those connections between them by them getting to know each other and spending time. So building that familiarity that Mark's talking about. So focusing on what we have in common rather than what we are, how we're different. Nice.
Nice one.
Okay.
So we do have a handout for you here. I know Laura was leading the charge. Was it Learning Live?
It was. So we had a similar conversation with a different group at Learning Live a few weeks ago, probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we had the opportunity of being in the room together, which helped. So we were in small groups and we were sharing what experiences we had of uncertainties, but also things that we tried. So we thought it might be fun to share with you, non-attributed obviously, because it was a safe environment, but some of the ideas that that people came up with. So we've got a little something to drop in the chat again for you. Here we go.
Thanks, Katie.
Just a one-pager, nice and easy. Thanks, Katie.
So if you click on the link, it should open up something in your browser that has some of the ideas from that event.
Yeah, there's a bunch of ideas. So I would definitely say, you know, grab hold of that PDF before we finish. There'll be lots of things that you can do individually or that you can take into your organization. So enjoy. Okay.
So whilst you're having a look through the some of those ideas, we just thought it might be an opportune time to open up the conversation to some questions. You can fire them in the chat, or indeed pop your hand up if you have any questions, that we can get you into the conversation. Nice one, Louise. There's some awesome ideas in there. Anything that you're still curious about on this topic?
Alternatively, you know, are there things that you'd like to pick up from the insight download? So I'm conscious we threw a lot of ideas and science at you. So what resonated with you? What didn't you know before? You know, what struck you about this topic that we've shared today? It might not quite be a question. It would just be great to hear your reaction to what we've said. I believe you can come off mute to do that. I'm hoping that's been activated, or obviously in the chat.
Any questions or any thoughts and reflections?
Cool. Thanks, Amanda. While we're on the stability, agility, I like to use this metaphor. I love a metaphor. I think it helps to explain things very well because it hooks into something you already know. The way to think about it, I think, is it's like pitching a tent at the top of a cliff. So you can imagine doing that. So it's windy, it's blowy, you don't really know whether the wind's going to change direction or not. You need to get a few tent pegs down to give you a bit of stability. But you don't need to nail absolutely everything down on this tent, because you might need to move position. So you might need to move your tent pegs, but you do need enough down to have a sense of stability and that you're not going to get blown off the cliff. So I think it's quite helpful to think of it that way, that you need enough stability, but you don't need to nail everything down. So the antidote to uncertainty is not certainty. You just need enough stability so that you could still be agile. So it's freedom within a framework, basically. So you give people just enough, or certainly enough, that they're sufficiently secure so that they can be creative and all the things that we've talked about. So yeah, think of the tent. Next time you're thinking about what do we need to get down, we just need a few of the most important tent pegs. It's the way to go. Thanks, Rachel. Take care.
So I guess our final kind of bit before we sort of, I guess, wrap things up in our last few minutes is the impact of not building connectedness within an organization and within teams, and deprioritizing amongst all the other stuff that, you know, frankly, many of us have to manage and contend with. So we know that it has a significant impact on reduced commitment to teams and organizations. People leave, and some of the studies on that are pretty compelling in terms of impacts. Performance and productivity goes down, where people become less engaged, and of course that has a big impact on overall satisfaction and retention. And I guess one of the startling bits to just sort of keep in the back of your mind is, you know, this idea of feeling isolated, which is a human experience, often comes with a shame associated to it. You know, over time can have the same impact as smoking, and they've equated it to 15 cigarettes a day. So it shortens people's lifespan significantly if it's not dealt with. So it's not just a business case. There's a broader human case to build connectedness across organizations and more broadly in society. So I guess that's our kind of final point, and I guess call to action. There's a whole bunch of work going on in organizations that's great, and thank you for sharing some of your ideas and sharing your time today. There's also an insights paper that you may be keen to explore, and there is a QR code on the screen that can give you access to a little bit more information that from ourselves in terms of our perspective on building connectedness and its impact on the workplace. Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Daniel.
Take care.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, everyone. If you forget the QR code, just jump on the Hemsley Fraser website. There's a tab called Insights, and there's some really interesting things there, including this paper. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.